Hello, this session is going to look at questioning, dialogic structures and oracy as part of the English subject development programme. I'm Louise Mower and I'm the Trust Lead for Literacy and Oracy. So this session is going to go through what's this oracy thing and why does it matter? How does conversation work and why sometimes doesn't it? What kinds of questions are there and what do they do? And how does teacher talk model and set up student talk? And then how can we effectively link individual utterances into wider discursive structures? So we're going to explore sort of those questions as we go through the session. So first of all, what is oracy? Well, it's an extremely important part of learning. The quote on the screen there is from Voice 21, which is the National Charity for Oracy in Education. Basically, through talk, we're all able to develop and explore ideas, we're able to build vocabulary, we're able to build our confidence, and it's essential to learning in every sort of subject discipline from the moment that we start to acquire language as a very young baby onwards. We start to then talk, we start to build that vocabulary, and it's really, really important to us. In the Oracy benchmarks report, Neil Mercer has said this, and I'm sure you're probably very well aware of the Matthew effect, the idea that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And in education, this really refers to the background that children come into school from. So you've got the middle class child who's in a house full of books with parents who speak in quite high level vocabulary, who are taken from one sort of club to another, sports sessions and dance, and they're meeting different people all of the time, they're talking to different people all of the time, and they're constantly building that vocabulary and that confidence to express themselves. And compare that with, unfortunately, a lot of the children who come into our schools in the Trust, who come from homes where there might not be any books at all, with parents whose own education and own language might be quite limited, so they're not getting that rich diet of vocabulary, they're not picking up those words that the more affluent children are able to. And in school, that gap just gets wider and wider because the affluent child has all the advantages and already has such a strong starting knowledge and already has such strong vocabulary, and the less affluent child doesn't and feels inferior, doesn't feel the confidence to try, and so on. So for us in school as teachers, it's really, really important that we are constantly giving students that diet of vocabulary so that they can build that, they have the opportunities to express themselves, they have the opportunities to try out and practice, so that when they leave school and they're going on to whatever they want to in the future, they can stand head and shoulders with peers who've come from any other sort of background and know that they can, the results might be one thing, but if they can't actually then go to an interview and win people over, if they can't convince people that they've got that something extra special, then they will get left behind, and we don't want that. So it's really, really important. So as I've mentioned, vocabulary is crucial. Building that vocabulary for students is absolutely pivotal. It's really important in terms of their life chances, as I've just spoken about, but it's also really, really important in terms of being able to access the GCSE exam papers that they're going to be faced with. And you may have heard of the vocabulary pyramid, and this is where we basically break vocabulary into 3 tiers. Tier 1 is those everyday words that are used all the time in normal conversations. Tier 2, these are high frequency words, which are kind of I would class as academic vocabulary. So they aren't specific to one subject, they can be used in a whole range of them, but they're words that wouldn't necessarily be used in everyday normal conversation. And these words are quite difficult for students if they don't have that diet of them, because they're not words that come up anywhere else that they're going to pick up. When we get to tier 3 words, which is more subject-specific vocabulary, so the example there, photosynthesis in science, if you think of something like onomatopoeia in English, these are words that we do teach within our subjects because they're terminology that students need to know. But it's that tier 2 that's the academic vocabulary of how we express ourselves, how we convince people that we're intelligent, we know what we're talking about, the sort of vocabulary that's used in questions and exam papers and so on. So it's really important that we are making sure that we give those opportunities for tier 2 vocabulary as well. And we'll look at this a little later in the session in terms of how we speak to students and how we model that. So how does conversation work in the classroom? Well, basically, it gives us that space to develop ideas and thinking. So that might be through a whole class discussion, it could be through paired discussion, group discussion, but it's that space to think about things, to try things out, to feel safe because you're not committing it all to being written down for somebody to mark. It's also an opportunity to explore different perspectives because you might have one idea, but talking to somebody else, you'll pick up that other idea. Okay, it's an opportunity for teachers to expose students to those different perspectives as well. As we've discussed, it's how we develop our vocabulary. It's a way of trying before we write things down, building our confidence. It's really important that students are able to listen well and evaluate and respond to what other people are saying. So not that they're just sitting there waiting to say their bit and they're not really listening and engaging with what's going on. And this is something that we can look at in our classrooms as well. And we can talk about, you know, how do we act as a good listener? How do we show the other people that we're listening? So basic things like making eye contact with the person who's talking or looking at the person who's talking, nodding our head to show that we're listening and we're taking in their ideas. So very, very basic things, but really important that we are sort of making it really clear to students what they need to do in order to do that well and in order to make the most of the opportunities that they can get from listening to other students, other people. It's also really important in a classroom, especially in a whole class conversation, that everybody's involved. If it's the teacher talking to one student and they just keep asking that student questions and following up with those questions, there's a danger that everybody else in the classroom's kind of like, well, I can have a rest now, or you know, phew, I've not been picked, right, I don't need to worry about that now, and stop listening. So it's really important that you target a range of students in the classroom, that everybody is involved and engaged. Everybody has a particular role if it's a group task rather than a whole class task, so that there's a reason for everybody to be ready and therefore stay focused on what's going on and therefore make the most of the learning. Conversation in the classroom really does need to be planned. It needs to be focused in order to develop learning. I don't mean that you can script absolutely everything that's going to happen, but you do need to think carefully about, right, if I'm going to have a discussion here with the class, what am I wanting them to get out of it? How am I going to get them to that point? What am I going to do? To make sure that you are steering them in the right direction and you are not just wasting time on a nice little chat that actually doesn't do anything in terms of learning. So sometimes conversation doesn't work in the classroom. It can be just because you've got closed questions, so you're not really getting students to develop ideas. It's just a quick yes no answer, and really there's not been any development in learning there. They already knew that you've just asked them. I don't know is a problem sometimes in classrooms because students are just saying it because they just don't want to answer, or they really don't know. And we're going to explore that in a moment in a little bit more detail. Another reason why it might not work is when a student gives an answer that shows a misconception and you don't challenge that, and then it kind of goes that way, and the students are remembering something that isn't really, one, a valid point, so it's not a good answer, it's not something that you want them to know, and two, your time's going, you're not focused on what you need to do. So we don't have to go, no, that's wrong, but very carefully we need to be able to say, well, I understand why you're saying that. I can see where that might come from. However, let's just look at the wider context of that particular quote that we're exploring, or that particular idea. Does that fit with the sense that we're getting from the rest of the text, for example? Tangents. Students are masters at going off on tangents, and you often get a student who's particularly good at it because they like to do it, like to get the teacher off task, so that they can all have a little rest and maybe listen to an entertaining story or something. Or a student who's desperate to talk about something that they're interested in, that they're trying to fit in to the topic, like a television program or something funny that happened, and you've got to be really good at saying, yep, that's not relevant. We need to, let's just focus back in and ask the question again. You know, thank you for that. We can talk about that later if you want. Don't get drawn into going off into some sort of anecdote or anything yourself either. So avoid those. Stay focused on learning, because you don't want that to be the thing that they remember from the lesson. Right, a really, really important one. If you are wanting students to discuss something, if you're wanting them to answer questions on something, if you're wanting them to work in groups talking about something, if they don't actually have enough background knowledge to be able to do it well, they are going to produce limited responses and they are not going to develop in their learning. So if you want them to discuss a character in a text in detail, and they've only seen 2 minutes worth of that character from the book, and that's just been now in the lesson, they're probably not going to be able to do that very well. If you want them to do some preparation work on a topic that they're going to write about for transactional writing, and you want them to write about poverty in India, but you haven't given them any information about poverty in India, you can't assume that they know about it, and therefore they're not going to be able to have a really good discussion about it because they just haven't got anything to talk about. So you have got to make sure that you are asking students to do, setting them up to do something that they will be able to do. So that's important as well, that they're prepared. And low expectations is another one which can cause problems. If you don't expect students to give really good answers, if you don't expect them to speak using academic vocabulary, if you don't expect them when they're doing a think, pair, share to talk to each other on the focus of the topic using the actual structure, then that won't happen in your classroom, and the discussion and the conversation won't be productive, and students won't move on with their learning. So here's an example of a poor dialogic structure. So it's the initiation response evaluation model, and you can see an example here. So we've got the teacher asking a question, the student giving an answer or offering an answer, and the teacher goes, well done, that's it, great. So what we can see from here is that the student's done really well there because they've correctly guessed what was in the teacher's head. I mean, the fact that they've even put alliteration as a question shows that really they're not even that confident about it. But where's the learning happening there? There's no development, there's nothing, and it's not really worthwhile at all. So here's a better structure, and I'm just going to give you a chance to read that over really quickly. So hopefully what you've noticed as you've been reading that is that the teacher is targeting a range of students. So we've got that no opt-out happening. The questions probe students to check their knowledge, so that it's checking understanding, it's doing that assessment for learning, but then it's pushing them deeper, it's pushing them towards analysis, which is really important. What would you do next here after this? So obviously you could continue that whole class discussion further, maybe trying to take a few other examples of alliteration from bayonet charge. Would be one way of going. You could then say, right, now work with your shoulder partner looking at the poem and just talk about those other examples of alliteration that you might find in the poem, develop those sorts of ideas and annotate your ideas on the poem. So I'm sure, and you may think of some other ideas, but that would be, again, where I would then develop that. Now, we mentioned before, I don't know can be a barrier. Okay, so what do you do when you get somebody going, you ask them the question and they'll come back to you and say, I don't know. So first of all, it might be, well, all right, so it may be off the top of your head, you don't know, but I want you to think about it. And in that case, go into something like Think, Pair, Share, for example, before you actually ask for the whole class feedback. So pose the question, get them to look at the text or talk about the idea that you're wanting them to look at. Give them that chance to do that and to use that structure before you take your whole class feedback. Just give wait time. So pose the question, give them time as a whole class to think about it, look for their answers. They know that you use no opt-out, so they know that you're going to be, it could be anybody you ask, and you give that pause. The structure that we quite like to use is pause, pounce and bounce. We use that across the trust. So you pause a question, you pause, then you pounce, you choose a person, then you bounce to somewhere else and you ask that other person to develop the idea or if they agree with the idea, and so on. And that can be really powerful. And again, that then sort of takes away the pressure of like that one person who's been asked, because they know it's going to go around the room. They've been given the chance to think about it. And also, if students are used in your classroom to the fact that you will give them wait time, but you will expect them to have thought about an answer, they'll get better at making sure they've got an answer in their head, even if they don't do it the first time. So you should have less shrugs of I don't and I don't knows. And again, just that other thing, is the reason that they don't know because you haven't actually given them enough learning in advance to help them be able to cope with the demands of the question that you're asking. Are you asking a really difficult question that you need to build to later in the lesson? So it all comes down as well to that planning and that thinking through those structures and thinking through where that questioning needs to be. Okay, so let's think a bit more about questions. I'm going to look at a few sort of different structures of questions that you might use and some things that might help you. So first of all, questions require students to think rather than report what someone else is thinking if they are going to be effective and if they're going to be useful in the learning in the lesson. Okay, so they need to have really clear and specific purposes, and we've talked about why that planning is so crucial. So here's 3 ideas that David Didow recommends you sort of think about in terms of your questioning, that you clarify, you probe, or you recommend with the questions that you ask. And this might be questions that the teacher asks. This might be questions that students put together themselves as well. And he has these question stems that are useful here. So to clarify, the ways that you might phrase that, to probe, and to recommend. Okay, so you've got those 3 different types of question and then some stems there to help sort of structure those questions. And you can see that these questions are all designed to get students to think carefully about their ideas, about what they are actually inferring or what they are trying to say. So another type of questioning that can be really useful is Socratic question stems. Okay, Socratic questioning is really useful, and again, it can be for teachers or it can be for students to use in discussion. So again, clarifying thinking is an important one, and there's examples on here. I'm not going to read everything out to you because I know obviously you can do that yourself, but so we might want to clarify, we might want to challenge assumptions, we might want them to sort of scrutinise the evidence that they are using or to actually find the evidence to support what they're saying. Looking at different viewpoints and perspectives, so thinking about things from other perspectives can be really useful, particularly in the study of literature. Thinking about implications and consequences, can be really useful as well. Okay, so we've got those Socratic question stems that you might use to plan out the questions that you're using. I've often found these really useful when getting students to work in groups looking at text and asking them to discuss and talk to each other, giving them some stems around that come from Socratic questions can really help them to ask each other better questions. So again, this is something that can be really useful. And also, yeah, obviously, why is that question even being asked? What was the point of that in the first place, and getting them to explore that idea. Andy Tharby talks about intertwining questioning techniques, and I do really think that this is a really, really powerful way of getting students to develop their thinking. So he has sort of 4 question types that he talks about. Questions that are checking understanding, questions that are for analysis, so higher level and more complex questioning, probing questions to push students to justify their ideas and make sure that they're actually solid ideas and they're not going to change their minds. And the last one, which I don't particularly think is a question, it's mini explanations. However, it fits in with the structure he uses. I'm going to show you an example of this here, and I'm going to give you a chance to read that over, and then I'll just talk a little bit about hopefully what you've noticed about how it works. So, having looked at that, obviously, first of all, you should hopefully have noticed again that no opt-out, a range of students are involved and engaged. And by varying the different questions, like starting with an understanding question, then pushing into an analysis question, and then probing further, that the learning, the thinking is really, really deepened here, and we get to some really, really good analysis, really top quality by the end of the section. Okay. So hopefully that gives you a nice example of how that might work in your classroom. I've just popped this grid in. John Sayer, is a geography teacher, a geography specialist, and he came up with these sort of questions for deep questioning, a planning grid for deep questioning. And you can see there, if you take something from the first side, which is the left-hand side, and something from across the top, in terms of planning your questions, it can help you build really good questions that will push students to think deeply. So I've just popped that in there because you might want to reference that later. Right, construction time, really important. Okay, so we do this really good discussion. You've just had that conversation about Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Roylott, and they've come up with some really good ideas. But if you just leave that and then move on to something else, it's probably, has been effective right there and then in the lesson, but it's probably not going to be retained. That students need construction time to help them transfer what they've learned into working memory. And also that's probably why, if you just did that in a lesson and then said, right, now I want you to write this essay straight away, you're probably going to find that there's quite limited, they've discussed it really well in the discussion and in the questioning, and then they come to write it down, it's much more limited in how it's expressed, and they haven't got that depth there which they can do in their talking. It's a common issue. So they need to have that time to transfer what they've learned into their working memory. So the best method in which they can do this is to have lots of opportunities where they're using what they've learned. Okay, so you can do this through getting them to go on and do some collaborative tasks, give them some new content and apply the same skills, get them to have some new content but think of their own questions about it and sort of develop that way. Quizzing to recap knowledge. Obviously we do that a lot in our bell tasks, but again, so that we're revisiting and we're embedding it, can be useful. And once they've had that chance to play with it a bit more, to develop it a bit more, to try it out a little bit more independently, they can then go on to that complete independence when they're writing in their own extended writing. So collaborative structures. There are obviously a range of collaborative structures. In terms of talk in the classroom, these are some of the most useful ones that I want us to just have a quick look at. They're great because they all provide a structure to support effective talk, rather than just saying discuss this and then sort of hoping that, you know, some pairs will do it really well and some shoulder pairs won't, and it kind of being a bit hit and miss as to how well students are already versed in being able to do that level of communication, how bought in they are to wanting to do it. If you've got that structure there, which is set up in your collaborative task, and students are used to using that, then you immediately are going to get much better quality discussion and talking going on. It's important to set up expectations. It's important to remind students of those the steps within the structures. So if we take think, pair, share, what's brilliant about think, pair, share is you give them that question, but then they on their own have a little bit of time to think about it and come up with their own thoughts and ideas on it before they then go into the pair. And so they've definitely actually got something to talk about. Now, as a teacher, going around the classroom, checking what students are doing, giving them, you know, little prompts and bits of help, that's really important. So, you know, you would spot if there was a student in the think time who was sitting there and not really doing anything, or somebody looking confused and needing a bit of support, or somebody who's got their planner page on red and needs you to go over. So it won't automatically, just because you've said right now think about it, that they'll come up with it, but it gives them that chance to prepare. It gives you that chance to just give a little bit of intervention where it might be needed as well. And then they're set up for a quality conversation with their shoulder partner. In terms of mentor then swap, this one, sometimes I think the first few times that you use this one, it's worth almost modelling what you would expect in terms of the conversation going on between the shoulder partners. So for example, when it talks about the second face partner watches, listens, coaches and praises, so how do you listen effectively? What does that look like? What should you actually be doing at this point? Giving eye contact to your shoulder partner, looking at what they're doing, listening to what they're saying, nodding in agreement. What does coaching mean? So we're not really critical here. You know, how can you phrase it? Giving them some stems to help them phrase what they want to say. So that's a good idea. Have you also considered and to give them another thought? Yeah, things like that can be really useful, so that the structure is actually used effectively, because mentor then swap can be really powerful, but it can also be really rubbish if people don't actually use it properly, and they're just kind of sitting there with one person writing and the other person just sitting and watching. So you've got to make sure that it's working effectively. Speak for my team, again, a really good one, because it gives that independent preparation time first. Making it really clear as well that when they come together as a team, the team's got that real strong focus. They've got to decide on what is the best answer and come up with that and negotiate that out. So they should be really focused on that in their conversation. Targeted interview, again, I think modelling is really useful when using this one. You've got as well to make sure that they have enough knowledge to be able to do this well. Otherwise, you've got limited questions and limited answers. So targeted interview really does need to follow some work that's already happened, so that then they've got that knowledge to be able to do it well. But all of these structures, all of these collaborative structures provide a structure, a series of steps that scaffold the talk, that help students to make sure that what they do in that task is effective and is useful in developing their learning. So we've already mentioned how teachers model essential vocabulary, and that some students won't get that anywhere else. Teacher explanations are really, really essential in lessons. You know, there was taught a few years ago talk about how teacher talk needs to be really limited. You can't talk to a class too much, that would be terrible. Well, no, you're the expert in the room, so you need to be able to give that knowledge to students, otherwise where else are they going to get it from? And you need to be able to give them that vocabulary, that modelling of vocabulary, or where else are they going to get it from? So that's really important. That said, don't just lecture on forever at the class. Think about what you're going to say, plan the things that you key learning points that you want to explain to them, if that's how you want to do it. Keep things clear. Using analogies and stories can help, but just avoid rambling. Just know when to stop. But teacher talk is absolutely vital for our young people. So in terms of in our classrooms, teachers need to be aware, we all need to be aware that we are modelling at all times in the way that we speak to students. We need to avoid slang. We need to keep using the academic vocabulary. Really, really important. And talk like an expert. Well, that is part of our feedback policy. So we know that when we are going around doing our live marking and we are talking to students about their work, that we need to be thinking about how we talk to them in a way that an English specialist talks, in the way that an English scholar looks at their studies, and that sort of point of view and that sort of level of vocabulary. It's really important. And there are real ways of upscaling student vocabulary when they are talking back to us without showing them up, without sort of going, well, yeah, a much better word to say would be. So just to give a couple of examples. A student says, my best problem is ambition. Well done, that's absolutely right. Yes, it is. The teacher, right, Macbeth Hamasha is his ambition. Just repeating back, just restating what they've said, but just popping in that terminology, that higher level that we want to include. And we want to push students towards. If we keep doing this, if we make this a habit, they will start to get that vocabulary. They love it when they get a new word and then they're trying to put it into their writing and they're trying it out all of the time. Okay, it is useful. Or another example, the writer makes us feel sorry for Rosabelle because she isn't rich like the red-haired girl. And the teacher, absolutely, the writer creates sympathy for Rosabelle through the contrast between her character and that of the red-haired girl. And so you're not saying, well, a better way to say it is you're just repeating what they've said, but just throwing in these phrases. And I would emphasize them, as I've underlined them and put them in bold there, I would emphasize them as I was saying them to the class, so that you're really sort of making overt those things that you want them to pick up on. So we also, following that model, can emphasise the use of discourse markers that we're using when we're speaking to the class. So the cruelty of Curly's wife is shocking to the reader. Nevertheless, the cruelty she herself has suffered is equally appalling. And again, giving them these stems as well for use in their own discussion, so they start to embed them, so that they start to become part of the natural way that they will talk within their English lesson, within their English writing then as well. So we want to be, as I say, encouraging students to think from that analytical English perspective when they are looking at their looking at texts and doing their work in English, just as we'd want them to think like a historian if they were in history. So examples of the sorts of questions that you might use there to help them build that analytical English perspective when you're looking at a text. Have you got evidence for what you're trying to do? Thinking about those different perspectives, thinking about different audience responses, for example, and there's many more things you could do, but just some examples there to give you an idea. So we want students to be able to talk like experts and we're trying to encourage them to do that. So we would highlight key vocabulary we want them to use when they're giving us an answer. I think it's really important to insist on speaking in sentences when students are giving a response. So you can say to them, you know, can you put that into a sentence for me? That's really good. Let's just put that into a sentence. Let's think about if we were going to have to write this down, how might we say it? That rehearsal for writing is really important. ABC questioning is a really useful method to use to ensure that students are giving those developed answers when they are responding to questions in groups and in whole class questioning. So if we just have a look at this, ABC questioning stands for A, agree with, B, build upon, and C, challenge. So these are the three different things that they might do, but it's getting them to build that confidence. It's starting to get them to think about engaging with other people's ideas. It's getting them also to build up those skills for perhaps debate as well. So you need to plan your questioning carefully. So for the ABC questioning, as you do with all questions we've talked about already, you bounce the questions around the room. Then you're demonstrating that differentiation. You've thought about obviously who you want to target with what. You're developing the learning for everybody then across the room, and everybody's staying engaged and everybody's thinking about whether they're going to ABC. And yeah, it's ensuring that active listening. Here's an example of ABC questioning being used. So here's an example of the ABC questioning being used. So if you have a quick look at that. Hopefully you can see that something quite simple has made student B have to give a really thoughtful response, and they've actually developed the learning in the room because they've built upon that idea. It's pushing students to speak in a more academic style, and that then helps them. It's that idea that if you can say it, then you can write it. If they've got more and more practice of talking that way, when it comes to writing it down when they're writing their analytical essays, when they're writing their answers on the language paper, they can do that really well. Okay, and they've got a real good set of sentence stems and structures that they can use. So we also need to think about skills for life. Our students need to be able to go out into the world and have the vocabulary and the confidence to engage with lots of different people and to win people over. We want them to have the skills and confidence to go to those interviews and have an equal footing with their peers across the country. You know, the students who've gone to Eton and had, you know, debates, and every week a different sort of important person come to speak to them, and they, you know, they've really had those opportunities. We want our students to be able to speak effectively, and a crucial part of that is debate. Okay, being able to debate ideas. So a really useful structure for this in the classroom is talking chips, okay, which is of course one of our collaborative structures. Again, it's got to be planned really carefully. If students haven't got knowledge that they can use, then they haven't got a series of reasons, and they can't do the debate, they can't do talking chips, and they need to have enough time to do the task properly to fully prepare for doing talking chips. I don't think you can kind of say, right, 2-minute collaborative structure, talking chips, off you go. This isn't one that works that way. So I'm going to just show you some examples from a lesson where this is being used. So thinking about the transactional writing for language paper 2 and practicing that, we've got a statement here. Boxing is brutal, barbaric and bloodthirsty and has no place in a civilized society. So the bell task there, right, what's your initial views about that? What are your thoughts about boxing? Do you think it's brutal, barbaric and bloodthirsty or not, you know? And students get a chance with that planning bubble there, for my opinion, just to jot down their initial thoughts. They might have 3 thoughts on it. They might only have 1 or 2, depending on, you know, what their views are, but they've started off and they've started with their initial thinking. Then they need some time to gather ideas. So we've got here 2 videos we used, short videos. One of them had Sugar Ray Leonard, the boxer, talking about his views on boxing and what it did. And the other one looked at most dangerous sports and it looked at various dangerous sports, including boxing, and gave some statistics and gave some ideas. Then, having done that and made notes on it, so they'd had their own initial ideas, they'd listened to some other ideas and they'd made some notes on those, they're then in more of a position to be able to go into the talking chips, which is again debating that statement. Once that's happened and they've gone through the talking chips and they've had that planning and preparation time before they've done the discussion, they can then add to their opinion bubble. They can then add further ideas, and they've really had a good chance to explore and develop. So that's a really effective way of using that talking chips. When students are doing discussions in the classroom, to ensure the quality of discussion, you would obviously be going around the room and you would be listening in, getting involved with prompting students and so on if it was necessary to help them. But then other things that you can do is this idea of spotlighting. So as you're going round, if you hear something that's really, really good, then you can actually just, if you have an agreed thing, like I'm going to put my hand up, for example, and the whole class sort of notice that, and you know, hands up silent signal, and you then get the class to listen into that group who are having a really good discussion. You're spotlighting it, and then that gives the class some more stimulus, but it also gives them an example of really effective and good quality talk. They may be using the ABC model really well in the way that they're discussing as well. Alternatively, you might pause the class in the same way, but this time just to say, I've heard this from this table and this from that table, or I've just heard this really good idea, and just pause it. And then students have got something again that might just develop their discussion, help them if they were struggling a bit, and as they go back into their groups and continue with the discussion. So they can be really useful things that you can do and you can use. And that, how effectively do we how effectively can we link individual utterances into wider discursive structures? So if somebody comes up with a really good idea, and they maybe give quite a short answer in questioning, or you're going around the room and doing some live marking and you notice something that somebody's done, you stop the class. So Ben's come up with this. Ben, why did you think of that? Where did that idea come from? The power of why, getting students to elaborate, really, really important and really easy way of doing it. You know, and also, Claire, can you add to that? You know, what do you think of what Ben said there as well? You know, being careful about just putting one person on the spot, of course, as well. ABC questioning brought in straight away with the individual utterance that has just come out. Ask the class, so this is a really good idea that Ben's had. Can anybody find any evidence that would support this idea? And getting everybody to sort of do a little bit of work on their own and then develop that into further feedback can be really important. I've just popped onto the end of the PowerPoint a series of questions from Andy Tharby, which can be useful in terms of helping you plan when looking at texts, the sorts of questions that you might write. I wouldn't give this sheet to students like this. No way whatsoever. There's too much on there, but you could select from there things that you might find useful in your planning. And I've also just put on there some starting points for further reading, some websites and some books. And as I said at the start, I'm Louise Mower, l.mower at northerneducationtrust.org. if you want to ask me anything as well. I hope this has been useful. I hope you've got some good takeaways from this. Thank you for listening.